Derby, New York. Was always wondering, I knew she got married because she was pregnant. But was my father really my father? I mean, this is what I've wondered. And Kev wanted me to go to Buffalo and get a swab of the inside of Alice's mouth so we could, but it was going to cost a couple $100 to send it for DNA to see if we both went together. When Pearl was up here for the last time, we got onto the topic of it. And I remember asking my mother, when did she have her first date with my father? And she said, August 27th, 1918. And she got married on October the 5th, 1918. But she had this boyfriend, and she used to talk to us an awful lot about him. And I know I told Alice, his sister's name was Teresa, or Teresa. And Anne and Bon apparently didn't quite approve of him. They were very strict with her. And, she went to live with them when she was about 12 years old because her mother died when she was 3, and her grandmother took care of her until she died, and she died when my mother was 12. So she went to live with Anne and Bon because they didn't have any children. So they got her just as a preteen. Anne was her mother's sister, and she was Mamie's aunt. Yes, she was my great aunt, and they were like grandparents to us. They lived next door to us. Well, next door out in the country was, there was a big field in between the houses. It wasn't right next door. My mother had all her deliveries at home. An old doctor called Dr. Brody. They didn't go to pediatricians way back then. I mean, they just had a family doctor, And let me see. The very first thing I remember was the night my brother was born. And I wasn't quite 3. He was born on the 26th of March, and we were living with Anne and Bon at the time. Because my father had, I know he was in bed for a long time. He had some form of arthritis, or they called it rheumatism. I don't know what it was. And in Anne and Bon's place, they had 2 upstairs bedrooms. And my mother and father had one, and Alice and I were in the next one. They used to call it Bean Street, but it was Wisconsin Road. And I remember hearing a commotion and some crying or something. And I think it was Anne that came in and said, "Oh, go back to sleep," or something. So we did. I mean, I wasn't quite 3. I wasn't quite as old as Evie is now. And then I remember standing in their dining room, and they had some kind of a rug on the floor in front of the door. And somewhere I got a hold of some matches. And I remember somebody say, "Oh my goodness, she's got the matches," just as I lit it, and she scared me, so I dropped it on the rug. And so they hurried up and got that out. But that wasn't my fault. I mean, they had the matches where I could get at them. So I remember getting a spanking. I must have been about 9 years old, and I don't know why. I probably didn't deserve it. But anyway, my mother grabbed a hairbrush and spanked me, and the hairbrush broke. So years later, when I was married and had children, we lived on Staten Island, I wanted to send her a gift for Mother's Day, and I bought her a new brush. And she wrote back and she said, "You don't forget, do you?" First thing I remember about school is how badly I wanted to go when I was 5, because you could go when you were 5. I've been one of the youngest ones in my class, having been born in June, and I wanted to go desperately, and they wouldn't send me because down on the end of our road, there was a crossroad, and there was a big house. I was trying to remember the family's name, but they had a son who was about 21, and he'd had polio, so he was crippled, and he hopped and he had crutches, and so they just thought that that affected his brain too, so they didn't think it was safe for me to walk down to that corner to get the bus. So I had to wait till Alice was 5. So I was a year and a half behind by the time I started school. And I can remember one day we were out playing in the summertime, and this poor boy with his crutches, he was on the edge of the woods going up toward my aunt's house, and he was hopping along, with his crutches, and my mother made us come inside. I mean, they were, it was a backward, what do you call it? Well, their mentality, they just didn't understand what polio was.
Who was your best friend?
God, I had a lot of them. I think it was probably Helen Aarons. And, there was Miriam Hutchings. And when Dad put a tent up for us on the land of the old lady next door to us, old Mrs. Parker, and to us she was ancient. Well, she probably was in her 70s. And so my dad put a tent up, and when the kids all heard the tent, they'd walk up from the lake shore to play with us in the tent. It was just a tarp thing that my dad put up, and he made a wood frame. In early October of this one year, we had a great big snowstorm. It was a terrific storm. And I know my father got stuck getting groceries in Angola, which was 5 miles away, and he walked all the way home carrying as many groceries as he could. And he didn't get there till the middle of the night sometime. And my mother waited up for him, and he also had some eggs that he was taking to the market because we had chickens. And so he stopped in at the dentist's house and woke him up and told him that he could have all the eggs he wanted in the car because he couldn't carry them all. We had a Model T Ford, and there was no heater in the cars in those days, and we had a big, heavy, they called it a horse blanket, and I think it probably was, but it had never been on horses, and it was a big, heavy thing. So we'd sit in the back seat all wrapped up with that around our legs and everything when we went somewhere. When I was 4 years old, he was working on a farm, and we had a little stand, an ice cream stand. An Italian fellow, his last name was Ellis. And I know when we got to high school, when we were little, about 4, I remember playing with her because her father would bring her over and she'd play with us. And then we met again when we got to high school, and she was in our class. It was up on the main road. We lived there. We lived in the house that was on the farm. I must have been about 4, I think. I remember also moving into a house. I guess it was after we left Ann and Bonds. We seemed to move around an awful lot. And there was a side road. It was probably a mile from Ann and Bond, maybe less. And I remember climbing up in the wheelbarrow, and I was about 3, and I know George was just a tiny baby. And there was a slate. The bottom of the barrel, the floor of the barrel, was like 2 boards together, and in the crack there was a sharp slate, and I went to climb into the wheelbarrow, and I cut my leg, and to this day I have that scar. I think it's on here, right about here. It's about this long. They didn't have stitches then. I mean, no, you wouldn't. There wasn't anywhere to go to get a stitch. So I ran in because I thought I was losing all that red stuff, and my mother washed it and put a bandage on it or something. But I remember that. Bon made us doll beds the summer we were living in this house where I lost all my blood. Anyway, I remember that there was a creek there. It ran through. It's still the 18-mile creek. And when the water was very low, it was just the shale, the stone bed, you know. And I can remember my parents having a party down there at night and having a bonfire so that they could see. And I can remember sneaking out of bed and standing on the edge of the bank so that I could look down. Then I had to hurry up and get back up to bed. They would drink. They would have their beer. Everybody made their own beer as a rule. My father used to make his own wine. He had dandelion wine and he had grape wine. And I don't think she ever drank anything. I mean, alcoholic. I don't remember my mother ever really laughing. I remember her telling me a lot of the times how clumsy I was. But she never did that to Alice. And I remember asking her one time if I was adopted because I said I didn't feel like I belonged. She got mad. What else do I remember? Oh, I can remember that we finally went to the dentist. It was the same dentist that my father told he could have the eggs. And that was in Angola, about 5 miles away where I eventually went to high school. And the dentist, we all needed, that was the first time I guess I'd ever gone to the dentist. Well, I was probably 10. Anyway, I had a lot of cavities. And it was going to cost $57 to fix my teeth. And Alice had some, but not quite as many. And her bill was going to be considerably less. And so they decided that since her teeth were in better shape, they would do hers first. And this was just another way why I always felt like I didn't quite belong. And the dentist said, well, he thought that they'd better do a couple of mine at least first, because otherwise I'd be losing them. So eventually we all got our teeth fixed. But those were hard times, you know. People were not very wealthy then. Before she was married, she worked up in the vineyards where my aunt worked. That's where she met my father. And he was the manager of the vineyards or something. And so they all worked, I guess, under him. And let me see. He just did different kinds of things. I don't know that much because I wasn't that much old enough to really know what he was doing. My mother made a lot of our clothes. She had a sewing machine, treadle. I know that in the summertime we had one good dress. In the wintertime we had one good dress. I have seen a picture of myself when I was with my mother's brother, my Uncle Jerry. And he had been out in Arizona, and he wasn't married at the time. He was younger than my mother. And there's a picture of Alice and I both in coveralls, you know, the whole things. Mostly dresses. I think I had shorts in the summertime. I remember when my grandmother Reed came to visit, the first time we ever saw her. And she came with my father's oldest sister. She was about 12 years older than my father. She was married, and his name was Sullivan, but I can't remember what his last name was. And they came on a hot Labor Day weekend. Oh, it was hot. And so they drove up in this car, and my grandmother didn't get out right away. She looked like a witch. She was all in black, and she was very stern looking, her hair drawn back. And my father made each one of us get into the car one by one and kiss our grandmother. Well, we didn't know her, you know, and it was just before I was going to start school, Alice and I, so I must have been about 7. And we had ankle socks on. And all the time she was there, she lectured my mother about how we were going to get pneumonia with bare legs like that. So I wasn't too impressed with her. Well, he had left my grandmother years before. But, well, she was, I don't know how many years older than he was. Oh, yeah, she was quite a she was quite a bit older than he was, as I remember. Well, I don't know. Maybe she was strict with him. I have no idea. They had 5 children. My father had 2 sisters and 2 brothers. So they had 2 girls and 3 boys. And I met one of my father's brothers years later when we were at Sardinia. We came over to the lake shore for a picnic at the beach at Lake Erie. And he was there visiting my father. I don't think they'd seen each other in years, but near the end of their lives, they got kind of close together. We met a cousin. My grandmother Reed had a sister, and they lived down in the oil fields of down in southern New York State. They used to have some oil wells, and we went down. It was a long trip in a car then, and we went on a Sunday, and I met my grandmother's sister and her husband, and my grandmother was there, and they had 2 boys about our ages. One was named Carl, and I remember we played with him all the time we were there. We had a good time. But they lived in a funny-looking house. Part of it was on stilts, I remember. And, I was in 3rd grade. And we, they had an epidemic of chicken pox. And I got chicken pox first. And I got the chicken pox first. And Alice came home from school. For a while, they allowed them to go to school, even though they had chicken pox in the family. And she came home and told about this new boy that had come in the class. They just moved in. His name was William Cross. And she was they were putting on some school program, and they had to learn a dance, and she danced with him. I don't know, they hold hands, and did bring around the rosy or some little thing. Anyway, so I thought, well, I wonder what he's like. And of course, I was glad he couldn't see me because I looked so awful. So when I got better, then they decided that we could continue to go to school if we didn't live in the same house. So George and I went up, and Pearl went up, and I think Pearl went. Maybe she stayed home. I don't know. We went up and stayed with Ann and Bon, and we loved that. We thought that we had a good time. We used to sit on Bon's lap, and he would sing to us. And so I went back to school. And just as a day or 2 before I went back, Alice came down with it. So I got to dance with William Cross. And she was so mad. And I didn't tease her, I didn't rub it into her, but I was gloating to myself. And when I think back on it, he wasn't that great. First date I ever went on. Well, I think it was a sleigh ride with this boy that everybody teased me about because he was born February 29th, and they'd say, he's only 4 years old. And mostly, though, what we did, we made friends with somebody who would be a senior because they could drive after dark. And so a bunch of us would get in the car. 7 or 8 of us would climb into a car and sit on top of each other to go somewhere where we could skate. And we used to go down near the railroad tracks in Derby because they had a nice black top of a road that was a bit of a slope. But I never really did learn how to really roller skate because I had to borrow skates. We didn't have any. So I never really got into that. When I went in training, I met Lou Rick. You've heard me talk about my friend Lou. Her name later was Zobel. And we were very good friends. In fact, when we affiliated at Children's Hospital, our rooms were next door to each other. And when we affiliated later, they did it alphabetically, and her name was Rick, so the R's were together. Mm-hmm. And we went to the Buffalo State Hospital, which was called the Insane Asylum. We had 3 months there, and she and I were roommates. And we had a big room. So she said, well, every one of my friends ends up dating Beezer, and this guy's name was she was Michael Zobel, was her friend, and his best friend was what was his first name? Beezer. Beezer was his last name. Anyway, every time we went out, we went together. I mean, double dating, and they'd say, "Well, what do you girls want to do tonight besides eat?" Because we always had, the food was awful at the hospital, and so they would take us somewhere where we could get a hot dog or something, you know. And she said to me one time, she said, "You've gone with him longer than any of my other friends." She said, "I think he must like you." It was about a year, and I had graduated. I was still going with him, but he and John Zobel, John Beezer, that was his name too, I think. So anyway, they were in a Naval Reserve thing, and they got a sudden notice that they were called up for duty, and it was before Dad and I were married, because the war in Europe had been going on, and we knew we were going to get into it eventually, and that's why they called these guys in the reserve, had to go and report. And right after he left, he even took me up to meet his parents, and I had a Sunday dinner with him and everything. And he was Catholic. So one Sunday we were going out to this cabin out in West Falls, and the cabin and the land on it belonged to John Zobel's sister, who was married and had a daughter almost as old as John. I mean, she was much, much older than John. John was one of a big family. And so we wanted to go out and go out to the cabin. We'd go out there in the daytime, and we'd have all kinds of outdoor games we'd play, and they had friends that came, and we had a good time. So anyway, and I had to get permission from my mother one time to go out there and spend a weekend in the winter time, but we slept down in his sister's house, because I was a student and I could not go away on a leave. You couldn't go away overnight without your parents, somebody gave you permission. Well, I was in training, 20, and you had certain nights that now you're a student, you go out and stay all night or do anything you want to. But you used to have to be in every night by 10 o'clock, and once a week you could have a late leave until 11. He was about 3 or 4 years older than I was. I'm trying to think, what did he work at? I don't remember what he and John worked at, but they were very, very close friends. And so he was beginning to talk about getting married. And I wasn't quite that ready. And so after he left, I graduated. And it wasn't until after I graduated that Dad even asked me out at all. And so for 4 times I refused him. And then one night as we were going off duty at 11, and everybody was changing shifts, there were a lot of people around the desk, and he said, are you going to go out with me and get a beer as soon as you're off duty? Or if you say no, it's the last time I'm going to ask you. And I thought, good, he's got that through his head. And all the girls said, oh, of course you're going. I said, I'm not going out and drink. I hated beer. I said, I'm not going out and drink beer in uniform. And they said, well, put your coat on. I said, I don't have a coat. I got my cape. And I said, I've got my hat. Well, I'll take your cap. Well, I mean, they just railroaded me into it. Come to find out, he didn't like beer either. And we went up to the, at the end of the block, well, it was about 2 blocks up. They were on the main street of Buffalo. There was an ice cream stand, ice cream place. So we went in there, and as we went in, they were playing Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree with Anyone Else But Me. So that became our song. And I don't think he smoked. He had a little pipe. It looked like a little curved pipe like Sherlock Holmes had. Only he didn't pull it out there. I saw that later. But I was just learning to smoke. And so I had to light a cigarette. I just wanted him to know that he wasn't with any young kid, you know. And I nearly choked on the cigarette. But I can remember I had a chocolate sundae. with a lot of whipped cream on it. I think it was 6 or 7 of the girls in my class married guys in his class, and I told him one time, I said, you know, as soon as you guys graduate from medical school, you went wife shopping, and they did. So anyway, our first date was about, I graduated September 12th, exactly 3 years from the day I entered nursing, and I guess it was about a couple weeks later that I went out on the first date. And then we had to take our state boards to get our RN, and those boards came from Albany, and there was no way you could know what was going to be on those tests. And, we all took Dramamine so we could stay awake at night, and we'd take it off of the ward when we weren't supposed to. Well, because we had to work, and then every morning you went for 3 hours for an exam, and then you came home back into the hospital and worked the rest of the shift. And you had to stay awake, and you had to study. Well, when I got to my exams, it said a 3-hour exam, and you had an hour and a half to do it. And you went just to say, if you didn't know something, you just skipped it. And you just went on the way, as fast as you could. But I came out tied for 3rd place in my class, and I thought that was pretty good. Anyway, and Lou tied for 2nd place, I think. Anyway, there was Stella Salk and Helen Anderson and Lou and I. We took the top, and I can't think who was tied with me for 3rd. I think Stella Salk was 1st, and Helen Anderson and Rick, Lou Rick, were 2nd. I was 3rd with somebody else, and I can't think who it was. Well, anyway, where was I? I signed up to go overseas with the base hospital, and I went to the meetings to get ready to sign up. And I came out from the meeting, and he'd be waiting for me with his little curly pipe, and he'd say, you don't want to go there. I don't want you to go overseas. It's a wonder I didn't do it just because he said not to. Anyway, the base hospital didn't get called until just before Sherry was born, because I went down to the train station to watch them all leave, and they were made up from different hospitals in Buffalo. But a lot of them were from the main general. And so I had Mary Jane Little, who I write to, and Ann Rumble. They had both been in my, I had an apartment with both of them before I got married, right after I graduated. And they went, I can't think who else, and a number of them from surgery. And anyway, and I had worked in surgery, only at that time I was back on private duty, trying to find a patient who would live long enough so that I could retire. And I went down to the station, and I was very pregnant, and there was a whole bunch of us that we went down to say goodbye to the ones that were leaving. About the 3rd or 4th date, he said we were going out to dinner, and we went over and met Evie and Grandpa. And oh my goodness, they treated me like I was a princess. And they called me Miss Margaret. It was all very proper. And I know I borrowed one of Mary Jane's gowns because I didn't own an evening gown, and we went to, was it the Saturn Club at Christmas time? And I have a picture of me sitting in Grandpa's house in Mary Jane's gown, which was a beige with big flowers on it, and I had a green velvet choker on because it just went with the dress. And then after Dad and I were married, we went to there was a big dance, I think at the Kleinhand Music Hall, where the orchestra, the symphony played and everything. It was a big fancy place, and Mary Jane loaned me a white, it was like a satin almost, evening gown, and from the waist up it had gold cord. You laced up with this gold cord, and I don't even remember what shoes I wore. She loaned me her robe, which was a black velvet with, it looked like white ermine trim. Oh, I tell you, I was pretty sharp. He had a tux. He had one because he used to go to all the debutante parties and stuff when he was in college, and he'd come home at Christmas time. Oh no, his family belonged to the Saturn Club. In fact, I think his father was one of the his grandfather was one of the founders of the Saturn Club. Oh yeah, the Olmsted family, not Dad's father, but his grandfather, were very high social people. And when McKinley. When McKinley was president, he came to Buffalo to open the Pan American exhibit. This was long before my day. And Dad's grandmother and grandfather stood in the receiving line, and she was standing right next to McKinley when the guy approached with his hand bandaged up and shot him. And she said she made some remark that was quoted. I can't think what it was. Oh, this poor man, or something like that, coming at him with his hand wrapped up. And so he shot him, and I guess he only lived a few days. But Theodore Roosevelt, who was it? Theodore Roosevelt, who went in when McKinley was shot? I think Theodore Roosevelt was earlier than that, but I think it was Theodore Roosevelt that for some reason or other he was sworn in as president in this mansion that was on Delaware Avenue. I got to look up that history because I'm sure Theodore Roosevelt was before McKinley. Anyway, that later on that mansion became a restaurant, and Dad and I had gone there to dinner a couple of times, and two of my class reunions were held in the same building. And so you see, I'm a little historical, a little history behind me.